memory is not a recording. And I know you've heard this before, you nodded and you moved on. Stay with me for a second, because if you actually let this land, really land, not intellectually register it, it changes the entire game, because your brain is not a video camera, right? When you remember something, anything from this morning or from 1994, for those of you that were born before, I want to know, I don't know who's watching, but it's not really playing back a file. It is rebuilding the memory from scratch every single time. So it pulls together those sensory details, the emotional charge, the meaning that you assign to it, the story you've been telling it, and it assembles the whole thing fresh right now through the lens of who you are today, which means the story about the chapter that you left, the one that still shows up at 2 a.m., the one you've been telling yourself for 20 years, it's not fixed. So every time you tell it, you get to change it, not the facts, but the meaning, the framing, the ending, and that's that memory reconsolidation. And that's why this week is the week I've been really building towards all month.
You're listening to Too Late My Ass, the podcast that exists because someone had to say it out loud. I'm Faye Chappell, and this show is for anyone who's been quietly wondering if they missed their window. Spoiler, you didn't. Your brain is still neuroplastic, your identity is still negotiable, and your second act, it's not a consolation prize, it's the whole damn point. Let's get into it.
So welcome to Too Late My Ass. My name is Faye Chappell. This is week 3 in April, and this is the one with the actual mechanics, not the inspiration, not the overview, the how. So today, I'm going to use that word that you guys hear a lot, which is neuroplasticity, which actually means when we're talking about identity change, it's not the Instagram version. It's the real version. It's the science of memory reconsolidation as like a tool, right? So there's a 5-stage story rewrite practice, right? So my own chapter work in actual detail, not the polished, not the retrospective version, but it's my own work. So the thing nobody warns you about, what it actually feels like to burn the old script. So I'll give you a little spoiler. Doesn't feel like liberation, not at first. So let's start again with neuroplasticity, because the wellness industry has absolutely butchered this concept, and I want to fix it right now. So what is it? It's the brain's ability, again, to change structurally throughout life, right? So it forms new connections. It strengthens pathways through use, and it weakens the ones that it doesn't want to use anymore. It's real and it's biological. And yes, it works in your 50s and 60s just as much as it did in your 30s. So the old idea that the brain solidifies after a certain age has been dead for decades. Science moved on. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Yeah, that isn't around anymore. So what it is not, neuroplasticity is not magic. It's not a magic switch that flips when you decide to become different. So you cannot think your way to a new brain. You cannot affirm your way into a new identity. And if your reinvention has kind of felt like you're pushing a boulder uphill for months and months and months, and watching it roll back down on top of you, I want you to hear this really clearly today. That is not evidence that you're doing it wrong, okay? That's not evidence that you're doing wrong. That's just that neural change that's starting to work. And it's slow, and it requires repetition, right? Requires emotional engagement. So it takes a while. So there's 2 mechanisms that really drive it, okay? So first is repetition. And we talk about that all the time. You do something again and again and again. You narrate something again and again. You show up as someone again and again. And that pathway that associated with that, it gradually gets stronger, right? So the neurons that fire together, they wire together. It's simple, it's true. And it's slower than you probably want. And the second mechanism is what we like to call emotional. It's an emotional path, right? So your brain flags experiences that have strong emotional content as important, right? And encodes them faster and deeper, right? So trauma will change somebody immediately because it's immediate, it's faster and deeper. So pleasant, simple things require years longer to do. And this is why the story rewrite requires more than just reading frameworks in a newsletter. It requires you to actually feel something while you do the work. So what does that mean practically? I mean, it's a lot of mumbo jumbo so far, right? Okay. The story rewrite is a practice. It's not a decision. It's not a revelation. It's a practice, something you do repeatedly with emotional engagement over time. So the old story doesn't get deleted. It's the old neural pathways don't disappear. What you're building is the new pathways, ones that are stronger and more available than the old ones. So it's kind of like a renovation, not a demolition, right? So the old walls are still there. You're just moving what's load buried essentially into a new spot. So again, takes longer than you want, but it does work. So one more thing before we get into that whole reconciliation science: sleep and stress, because these matter more than people realize. Okay. This whole consolidation, this structural change that we're trying to get to so that we can become that person that we want to be now, it happens primarily during sleep, and deep sleep specifically, because that's when your brain processes and stores what it learned that day. So if you're chronically sleep deprived, which a lot of us are, and let's be honest, a lot of people in major life transitions, right, are in that space right now. So your brain literally cannot consolidate the new story as effectively if you're sleep deprived. So you're doing the work and it's not sticking. It's not because you're doing it wrong. It's because you need more sleep, as silly as that sounds. So the other piece, the problem, is chronic stress. Chronic stress obviously makes it worse. So you hear a lot about cortisol levels, right? So high cortisol actively interferes with your brain's memory and its consolidation at night, right? So the person that's grinding through a massive life rewrite is also running on empty and underwater, basically, with stress, right? So this is why breath work, and that's why we do it on the Sunday ritual, are really, really important, because that helps control stress and cortisol levels. So if you haven't done any of it, join us on Sunday mornings, because we do breath work every single Sunday, and then you can do it throughout the week. So you need to regulate first and then rewrite in that order. Got it? So here's the thing that changed, so I really understood story work completely. Because for decades, neuroscience held that once a memory was consolidated, fully stored, like in that long-term memory, it was essentially fixed, right? It was stable. You could layer on new experiences, but the original memory was locked in. But now researchers discovered this reconsolidation. And as it turned out, that every time you retrieve a memory, it enters a briefly unstable state. So the proteins that hold the memory together, they break down. And during that window, that little window, before the memory is reestablished, it's malleable, it's changeable, right? So new information that you introduce in that window can actually be incorporated into how the memory is stored. Okay, so this is really important. It's actually huge, particularly for trauma work, but it also means it's, for our purposes, it's a lot simpler to understand. So every time that you tell your story, you're not just reporting on what happened, you're participating in how it's stored. So the meaning you assign in the telling becomes part of the memory, which means that the way you've been narrating, for example, your corporate departure, your burnout, your transition, all of it has been shaping how those chapters are encoded in your brain. And you've been kind of giving it code every time you open your mouth about it. So now we are going to try to do it deliberately. So here's an important caveat for this, because I need to say this. Reconsolidation does not let you change the facts. What happened actually happened. You're not going to create something new. You can't retroactively get passed over for a promotion, or you can't unleave a job or unhave the thing that knocked you sideways. Those facts are really there. They're immovable, right? So what is not immovable is the meaning that you assign to that, right? So the function that the chapter plays in your entire story, whether it's a chapter about failure or preparation, whether it's a chapter about loss, whether it's a chapter where you were the passive recipient of something that happened, or if you're the person who, to be brutal, was the one doing it, right? So here's some facts. Completely different story. And the different story told with enough emotional engagement at the moment of retrieval could actually gradually become the version that runs on default. Sounds kind of complicated, right? What does that mean? Okay. Before we get into everything, hope you're still with me. There's one more piece of science I want you to think about, which is called prediction error, because this is what determines whether the reframe actually produces that reconsolidation or it just replaces one surface narrative with another, okay? So this reconsolidation works best when there is a prediction error, when the reframe surprises the brain slightly, when it doesn't just confirm what you expected it to, okay? So the comfortable reframe, the easy spin, but I learned so much from what happened to me, that doesn't do much, right? Because there's no disruption, there's no real update. It's the same thing you've been feeding your brain all this time. So the reframe that produces reconsolidation is the one that actually initially feels wrong, might feel a little too large, a little too generous for yourself. The one where your first response is that actually true? Or am I just being kind to myself? Saying actually true, or am I just being kind? Because that friction is not evidence that the reframe is false. The friction is evidence that the reframe is actually doing something. Okay. So I said at the top of this month that I would show you the actual work, not just the framework. So this is the moment. So if you've watched the last two, hopefully, or you've listened to the last two, I hope you have. If you haven't, go back and do it. But the chapter I want to walk through is the corporate departure. Let's start there. So I've mentioned it before, right? In the episode and newsletters and various contexts, but I've always given you the processed version, the one where I already know how it ends, right? The one where the reframe is solid and the sequel is visible and the story holds together because I've told it over and over again. But today I want to give you the version from before that was true, because I think that's the version that actually is useful to you if you're doing this work right now and finding it harder than you expected, right? So stage one is leaving corporate, right? The transition into Too Late My Ass, the years between the end of my career and the beginning of this one. That's what we're going to talk about. That's the chapter, okay? The source document I'm going to talk about is really the honest version. So here's what my brain was actually running for years after it happened. I left because I had no choice. Gord, my husband, had a catastrophic stroke. So the career I had built was simply incompatible with the reality that followed. I didn't decide to leave. I was pushed out by circumstance, right? I had no exit on my own terms, no triumphant pivot, just it happened. And I had to figure out how to do it from a reduced kind of set of options, right? And that was it. That was the done to quality in it, right? The fact that the departure wasn't chosen. And it was doing enormous work in my story for a very, very long time, because underneath all of it, what I built afterward, there was a question, right? It was quiet, persistent, and kind of embarrassing to admit. Would I have done something more significant if I'd had the choice? Think about that. That's the source document, right? Would I have done something significant if I had the choice? Or am I just using I didn't have a choice as the story, and so it sounds better and easier for me? So I built something that I'm genuinely proud of now. And for years, alongside that pride, there was this background hum, right? Was this the best I could do? Or was this the best I could do from that compromised starting position, right? How many of you are starting to recognize yourselves in this, right? That you said, oh, well, I didn't have a choice, or I had to retire. And so, this is what I did. So there was also, and this one takes a little longer to see, okay, a chapter in that source document whose competence peaks during those corporate years, right? So there was a version of me that ran the global P&Ls, right? Had the organizational authority, right? I walked into rooms that required institutional backing. And so a quiet question about whether that version was the real one and whether everything since has been softer and smaller and more personal brand version of something that was actually impressive when it had the structure behind it, right? So if you recognize the structure, the comparison between that institutional version and the current version, the question about whether the second act is real professional life or kind of a creative downgrade, I want you to know that it runs in almost everyone who comes to this work from a corporate background. It's not unique to you. It's not evidence of the comparison about being accurate. It's evidence of very old credentialing, I guess you could call it, conditioning running without examination, right? So stage 3, and we talked about doing the autopsy last week, right? So whose voice is in that source document? Well, part of it was me, right? The source document that said, I had no choice. Part of it was me and that genuine grief of an exit that wasn't on my own terms. And that's legitimate and that's real, right? Part of it's corporate culture, and it's significant. Environments where departure of any kind, whether it's you've been let go or you retired, it reads as failure or abandonment. Whether, you're leaving before you finished, or whether you're in transition. I spent 20 plus 25 years inside cultures with very specific stories about what success looks like and what it really means when someone's path kind of changes, right? So a much older voice, older than any corporate environment, with very specific ideas about what kind of work counts, real, serious, professional achievement, and what kind of work is more personal, more relationable, softer, right? That older voice, that voice is installed long before I entered that boardroom, right? That voice had a lot to say about podcasts and communities and reinvent your work and whether any of it really was serious enough to be called professional. So when I identified that last voice, when I traced it back past the corporate years to something much older, my relationship to it changed because it stopped feeling like my own considered opinion. Okay. It started feeling like something I'd absorbed from the environment, which meant I could evaluate it, which meant I could put it down. So that was when I had to do the reframe, right? So in the reframe chapter, we are not, it's not about your forced departure, right? It's about what could actually be true in it, what would be true. So I spent 20 years, again, developing a specific capability, set that it was exactly right for what I was doing, right? The global experience, the P&L, the accountability, the executive level thinking. That's not credentials from a previous life. That's the foundation of a specific credibility that I bring to all of this work. It's not decoration, it's source. So here's the one that initially felt wrong, the one with the prediction error. Gord's stroke was not the thing that derailed a good career. It was the thing that made the next one possible. Not because crisis is secretly good. I don't like when people say, oh, well, I did something, this happened, and then all this great things happen. Not because suffering always produces growth, because it doesn't. But because I would never have left a professional world that was functional. I would have stayed. I would have continued being very good at something that was maybe smaller than what I was capable of. So the departure, and as unwelcome, I guess, as it was kind of like a door opening and not the door closing, right? So that reframe, it kind of felt dishonest for a long time, kind of like making poetry out of something painful, because it didn't feel good to say that something could come out of it. So I tested it repeatedly, right? Would I trade what I've built for the corporate career that might have continued? No. The honest answer, which surprised me when I could finally access it, is no. Not because this is more prestigious, but because this is more mine, because it was chosen eventually, even if in the beginning it really wasn't, right? So when you get through all that, you get to that sequel, right? Which is where we are. The sequel is already happening. It's the podcast, the community, the work. The sequel doesn't need to be earned anymore. It just needs to be registered as real, right? That's what this whole 5-stage is. It's actually is permission to stop holding that current thing of what you're doing at arm's length. It's to stop treating it as, provisional. It's to say, this is the chapter now. It's here. It's already real. So stop waiting for it to be more real than it actually is before you inhabit it, right? So let me give you the full practice in usable form, okay? Not just the framework. What actually happens in each stage, where it gets hard, and what do you do when it does, basically. So I want you to pick one chapter of your life, not 5, not all of them, because everyone's got problems. One, specifically the chapter that is doing the most active work in your present day life. The one that shows up most often in how you explain yourself. So I want you to, how you introduce yourself in professional words. The one you feel a slight pull away from when I say pick one. That's the one you pick. So I want you to, now you picked it, write that source document. This is the most important stage and the one that most people actually skip. Not because they don't know what to write, because actually writing it is uncomfortable in a specific way. Because you have to write the honest version, not the sophisticated observer, not the therapist-approved version, not the 2 a.m. version, the one you feel slightly embarrassed if somebody read, okay? And I want you to write it in the present tense. This chapter is about, not was. Present tense keeps you honest about the fact that it's actually still active, right? So how do you know when you've written the real one? It makes you slightly uncomfortable to read it back. There's something in it that you don't really want to say out loud at a dinner party. That discomfort is the signal. That's the material you need. So if you read it back and it feels fine, then you wrote the polished version. So go ahead, write it all out. And then next we move to the autopsy, right? We talked about this, 3 questions. So whose voice is in this document? Whose voice is it? The parent, the organization, the culture, the comparison, the mentor who told you something about what you were or weren't. I want you to trace it. I want you to find out where you installed it, because voices are much easier to put down when you actually realize they didn't belong to you. And what function is this story actually serving you now? Because every story we tell ourselves is doing something. It's protecting us from a specific exposure. So we maintain a specific floor so the drop doesn't feel so far, right? So what does this story do for you? What would you have to look at directly if it has changed, if you want it to change? And what is it costing you? Not abstractly, but specifically, what ceiling does it create? What opportunity does it make you quietly sidestep? What version of yourself does it prevent you from claiming out loud? And when you've done that, you can do the reframe. It's not a happy spin. It's just the honest alternative, okay? So if this chapter about preparation rather than loss, what is it actually verifying? What is it telling you is true? The question is not, what can I feel better about? It's what genuinely is true that that source document has been kind of obscuring, right? So, good reframes feel slightly wrong again, not comfortable. There's always friction, right? So if your first reframe feels completely natural and easy, I want you to go deeper because the brain changing version is the one you have to sit with before it feels true. And then I want you to write the sequel, not what you hope comes next, what is already here, the work you're actually doing, the person you're actually becoming, the choices you're making for this new version of yourself, whether you claimed it or not. So I want you to write that again in the present tense. Write it as though it doesn't need to earn your confidence anymore, because it doesn't. The chapter is real. The sequel is happening. And all that's left is for you to register it. So I want you to really do this. I want you to write your chapter, write it ugly, write it true. Don't clean it up. That's it. That's the whole assignment. You'll understand why when you do it, okay? It'll make way more sense if you actually do it. So let me tell you something nobody in this reinvention space clearly says enough of. Burning the old script doesn't feel like freedom. Not immediately. It feels like grief, and not the immediate dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that has you sitting with a chapter that you've been carrying for years. Even the limiting chapter, even one that isn't serving you anymore. And the feeling, the weight of it actually means you need to let it go, because that chapter was real and you lived inside it and you made decisions from it and you built things from it. You organized years of your life around a story that now you can clearly see wasn't quite as accurate as you may have been saying, right? And when you recognize that, it's loss, and it's a real one. And the temptation, especially for people who are good at doing this work, which is probably most of you if you're still listening, is to skip straight to the reframe, right? You want to package that loss as growth because you've actually felt it. Look what I learned. Look where it brought me, which is sometimes true. And sometimes it's a way of bypassing the grief, which means it stays packed away down somewhere and shows up later or as something else. So let it be what it is. The grief and the sequel can coexist. You can be sad about the years that you spent inside a story that wasn't quite yours. And you can also be proud of what you built from inside it and genuinely excited about what's to come next, right? They're not contradictions. They're just the full picture. So don't rush towards giving meaning to that grief. Let it just sit. It will move when it's ready. So trying to accelerate it just drives it underground, right? Where it keeps running as background noise while you're performing, trying to move on. And don't interpret that discomfort as evidence that the rewrite isn't working. The discomfort, again, is precisely the evidence that it is. For those of you who've ever done acupuncture, sometimes they'll put a needle in and it'll hurt. And that's where the needle should be, because it's removing things. It's getting things organized, right? So you need to make sure that you're understanding that sometimes this little discomfort is what you need. You just don't know that yet, because you've been holding on to protection and scaffolding for so long that you kind of forget what it feels like to actually be clear and free. So next week, the new chapter goes public, okay? So we've been working on identity and consolidating everything in private, right? So we're working on our stories. We've been doing autopsies. We've been trying to figure out what our life is really about. And now we have to go to being a little more public, because visibility is not optional. It's actually part of the whole mechanism. And that's the closing week of April. So that's next week. And it's the one that makes everything, all the work, everything you've done this week stick. So again, if you want to move forward, you want to do that next week with us, then you have to write that source document first. That one chapter, the honest version. Don't show anyone if you don't want to, but I want you to write it, because what you find in that document is the foundation for everything that comes next. So Inner Circle members, our community, that 5-day story rewrite challenge is live in your portal. And day 2 has some additional coaching on the source document specifically. So post in the community thread when you've written it. The collective recognition of my source document sounds a lot like yours is one of the best things about being in community, because you can see that other people are in the same area as you. And remember, this is the hardest stage when you do it. You'll understand why it's important again when you're going through it, because this is what's going to make your transition really effective to whatever it is you want to do with the rest of your life, because it's not too late, my ass.
And that's a wrap on this one. If something landed for you today, sit with it. That's your nervous system updating its software. Let it run. And if you want to get deeper, the Long Game is our daily ritual app, 15 minutes a day, built around the move, mind, and meaning framework. It's the daily practice behind everything we talk about on this show. And you can find it at tlmalonggame.com. And if you're ready to be in the room, the Inner Circle is where we do the real work. Monthly masterclasses, identity challenges, and a community of people who are done playing small. Join us at toolatemyass.com/inner circle. Until next week, stay rebellious. I'll see you then.